Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we are starting Unit 2. So Unit 2 is all about biodiversity and the living world. It's going to be a really short unit, but we're going to kick it off with actually two topics today. So I'm going to split this lesson into two different videos. The first video we're going to be talking about biodiversity, and then the second video we're going to be talking about ecosystem services. So it's all one lesson, but I kind of want to divide it up into those two topics. So without further ado, let's get started. If you hear background noise, it is my dishwasher. I apologize in advance. I didn't think about it before I turned it on, before I sat down to film this video, so hopefully it doesn't drive you too crazy. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump right in. So after this lesson, we should be able to identify key environmental indicators and their trends over time, and then define sustainability and explain how it can be measured using the ecological footprint. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But today we are focusing on biodiversity. So something we need to be aware of is something called ecosystem services, and these are the processes by which life-supporting resources such as clean water, timber, fisheries, and agricultural crops are produced. So these are the things that we need really as humans to survive that are provided to us from our environment. And then an environmental indicator is an indicator that describes the current state of an environmental system. So there are 5 key global indicators we need to know about. The first is biological diversity. So recently there's been a large number of extinctions, and the extinction rate is increasing. A lot of scientists think that we're in the middle of a 6th mass extinction. So outlook for the future, extinctions will continue and the environmental impact of this will be negative. We are a part of a living, breathing system. People don't realize it. Sometimes as humans, we think of ourselves as the top of the food chain. We have, comprehensive thought and technology, but we really are entangled in our environment with all the other creatures on this planet. And when we negatively impact other organisms, we in turn negatively impact ourselves. Food production, per capita production is possibly leveling off, meaning that it's not increasing. There's really not an unclear outlook for the future, and it may affect the number of people Earth can support. So our food production comes from agriculture, and we'll talk about a whole unit of agriculture a little bit later. We do have new technology for food production. So we've got GMOs, so they're genetically modified crops that can help us, grow like drought-resistant crops and things like that. But at the same time, our earth is changing. We are overproducing certain crops. We are destroying our soil, and we're losing fertile farmland. So it's not really clear which way our food production will go. And if our food production slows down, ultimately the amount of humans that can be supported will decrease. Another indicator is going to be our average global surface temperature and our carbon dioxide concentration. CO2 concentrations and temperatures are increasing. They will probably continue to increase, at least in the short term, and the effects are uncertain and varied, but probably detrimental. So increased CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We'll talk about it in depth as we go through this course. But basically, as we are continuing the combustion of fossil fuels, we're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. Global temperatures are warming and our climates are changing. We're seeing, more intense storms. People will be displaced by these storms. We'll see sea level rise and just a whole host of issues. Human population is another indicator. It is still increasing, but the growth rate is slowing. So the rate at which our population is growing is slowing down. The population is leveling off. Resource consumption rates are also a factor. So some things we'll talk about developed versus developing countries, but in developed countries, more women are waiting later to have children. And then they're not having as many children because we have access to birth control. So that can contribute to population levels kind of leveling off, but also having access to resources to even be able to raise a family is also a factor. And the impact on environmental quality will be negative. And then finally, an environmental indicator that we need to know about is resource depletion. So many resources are being depleted at rapid rates, but human ingenuity develops new resources and efficiency of resource use is increasing in many cases. So the outlook for the future is unknown, and the overall impact would be increased use of most resources has negative effects. So when we think about the combustion of fossil fuels, it's a finite resource. We're running through that really quickly. But at the same time, we're a part of a generation, you know, my generation and your generation, that will really probably be on the precipice of really starting to utilize clean energy, which can be positive. So as technology increases, the possibility for new energy sources also increases as well. So we're going to go into talking about biodiversity, and this is just the diversity of life forms in an environment. So how diverse is an area, and this can be on a genetic level, a species level, and we'll get into that. So there are different levels of biodiversity. So an ecosystem diversity is the variety of ecosystems within a region. So like on this island here, how many ecosystems exist? Remember, ecosystems can be large or small. Species diversity is the variety of species within an ecosystem. So in one ecosystem, how many different types of species are there? And then genetic diversity is the variety of genes among individuals of a species. So if you think about humans, we as humans are one species, but we've got a great amount of genetic diversity. We look different, you know, in our hair color, our eye color, our skin color, our personalities, our heights, our weights, all kinds of genetic diversity in humans. But that also applies to other species as well. So genetic diversity is just a measure of the genetic variation among individuals in a population. Populations with high genetic diversity are better able to respond to environmental change than populations with lower genetic diversity. So the theme here for today is that those environments that have a greater biodiversity overall will be more likely to be able to adapt to any kind of like negative factors and any change. So high biodiversity is definitely a good thing. Just a reminder, a species is a group of organisms that is distinct from other groups in its morphology, behavior, or biochemical properties. In order to be part of a species, you have to be able to mate with somebody else of your species and produce fertile offspring. That's like the scientific definition. Species diversity is just the number of species in a region or a particular type of ecosystem. Speciation is an event which is just the evolution of a new species, and this can happen through things like isolation, land barriers, things like that, and that's just something that you learn in biology. And then the background extinction rate is the average rate at which species become extinct over the long term. So every day different species go extinct, and there is just a certain measure of that that we can kind of have going on in the background. But recently, extinctions have been on the rise. Ecosystem diversity is just a measure of the diversity of ecosystems that exist in a given region. And it's difficult to estimate the number of species on Earth. So in any given place, it's common to measure biodiversity, but estimating the total number of species on Earth is challenging. So we've named approximately 2 million species, which means the total must be larger. So basically, even though species are dying out, scientists are also discovering new species every single day. And sometimes it's just because there are species that are very closely related, so we don't even realize that there's been a speciation event and they're their own species now. But also, think of like the places that we haven't even explored, especially like in the ocean. There are parts of the ocean that we haven't even been able to reach with technology, and there are all kinds of weird, like creepy crawlies down in the depths. So we just haven't discovered them yet. And we're discovering new ones every day. We can measure biodiversity in terms of species richness and evenness. And this goes hand in hand with your independent practice today. So richness is the number of species in a given area. So how many species total are there? And then species evenness is the relative proportion of individuals within the different species in a given area. And then knowing the richness or evenness can kind of give a baseline and be used to determine how much an ecosystem has changed. So let's take a look at this image here. So there are these trees in an ecosystem. So here we have 4 different types of trees. So these are 4 different tree species, A, B, C, and D. So we've got 25% A, 25% B, 25% C, and 25% D. So here in Community 2, we have the same species. So we've got the same number of different species. So A, B, C, and D, but they're distributed differently. So we've got 70% A and then only 10% of the rest. So in this community here, if we go back and look, this community is rich in species and the species are even. So it's got a high number of species and a high number of species evenness. However, in this second community, we still have a high number of species diversity because we've got 4 different types of trees, but the evenness is skewed, right? So the evenness of this community is skewed towards the species A. So just a reminder from bio, the evolutionary relationship among species can be illustrated using phylogeny, and this is the branching pattern of evolutionary relationships. So the more similar the traits of 2 species, the more closely related they are. And this is just showing you the present day, so past on the bottom, and it goes up to the present. And everywhere we see this tick mark on one of these branches, it just shows the development of a new evolutionary trait. So here's our notochord, then our vertebrae, our hinge jaw, 4 legs, and then mammary glands. So our lancelet would be our kind of less evolutionarily advanced, and then our chipmunk would be the most because the chipmunk has all of these things. So we're going to talk briefly, I'm going to try to get through this on this particular video, about the 6th mass extinction. And basically this is just talking about the decline in our species on the planet at the moment. So scientists estimate that the world is currently experiencing approximately 50,000 species extinctions per year. That's a lot. The United Nations Convention of Biological Diversity estimates that the current rate of extinction is 1,000 times higher during the past 50 years than at any other time in human history. Some declines in genetic diversity have natural causes. So this is not necessarily all human caused. Species, again, there's that background extinction rate. Species die out naturally, okay? It occurs naturally over time. But humans are kind of a driving factor at this point in seeing an increase in these extinctions. So high genetic diversity ensures that a wider range of genotypes is present. So remember, having a high biodiversity is good for an ecosystem. Populations with lower genetic diversity are prone to inbreeding, which can cause the offspring to have a poor chance of survival and later reproduction. So if you don't have a lot of diversity and you have a lot of inbreeding in a population, I mean, it's illegal for humans for a reason, because if a brother and sister were to have a baby together, they're so similarly related genetically, the chances of that child having a disability or having genetic issues is very high. So just having a higher genetic diversity improves probability of surviving future change in the environment. There's concerns about declining genetic variation in domesticated species of crops and livestock. So we breed our crops and we breed our livestock to be a certain genetic way because that's how consumers like them. So, you know, you breed your cows and your chickens to be larger, and your crops are GMO to be drought resistant. But the issue with that is that if anything were to happen, like a virus or an infection or something, the chances of those crops or those livestock surviving would be lower. So it's just something to think about. We do have a low genetic diversity in our crops and our livestock. And then just some vocabulary here. A threatened species is a species that have a high risk of extinction in the future. Near threatened are species that are very likely to become threatened, and then the least concern are species that are widespread and abundant. They're not on that endangerment list yet. And this is just a pie chart of different kind of organisms and how many are threatened, near threatened, and then least concern. So the least concern are the green, near threatened are pink, and then the threatened are this orange color right here. So I'm going to stop this one here, and then I will do another short video for your ecosystem services, and then that'll wrap up lesson 1.